we've seen this. We can show it in a lab, you do experiments on it. But it's not quite genuine. It's not quite true because it's not pure chaos. There is chaos theory really talks about nonlinear dynamics and the ability to predict things with our current mathematical tools, which are mostly based on linear systems.
So I'd also push it back a bit further to what we were saying earlier. When they say we started off with the two gods that they have, which is time and randomness.
Just two of many.
Yeah, two of many, right?
That's just my favorite obvious example.
If ontological randomness does not exist, and it's only epistemic randomness that we're talking about, even this argument that chaos can generate order makes no sense anymore. Because everything's determined.
Yes, it does, correct.
So often...
You will struggle to find many people who will accept that so easily. It's a very delicate... I had to stop and think for a moment through the stuff. That's going to be a very difficult sell to someone who doesn't, really doesn't see your worldview. You don't have to necessarily take it, but they have to be able to see your worldview. Okay. But it is, I would agree.
Okay.
It's strong, it's just difficult to get across.
Good. So I think I definitely want to bring you for an interview. We'll do an interview, inshallah. We'll do an interview. We'll have... In fact, it'll be nice to break down your story into segments because we kind of went in many different directions. But the last thing I just want to put to you is, Thomas Kuhn, he argues about paradigms and paradigms being incompatible.
Yes.
Meaning, for example, Newtonian mechanics and the Einsteinian worldview, time, space, even have different definitions. Even mass has a different definition. And what he's saying is to switch between one to another is not just observation and evidence. Calls a gestalt shift. The images which change. Would you say your shift from materialism, atheism, physicalism to Islam, obviously there was an input of you studying theoretical physics and doing all this stuff, but there was an element of a choice that I am no longer going to live in a world of inconsistency. I want to be consistent with one deity rather than many.
Oh no, so I never wanted to live in a world of inconsistency. I never wanted to be a hypocrite. I just didn't realise how much I was an inconsistent hypocrite.
Right.
That's important. And I don't think there exists any atheist except that they are an inconsistent hypocrite. In the nicest possible way to any atheist out there. It's not your fault you're wearing this lens, But
you've upset them.
You see what I mean? It's not that I suddenly went, I want God and to reject those things. I always wanted to reject, So if you take your example of Newtonian mechanics and, Einsteinian general relativity, Poincaré's relativity, I could say, but that's another story. It's not really right to say Newton's wrong. It's correct within its domain of validity. And the concept of domain of validity is really, really important to understand. So, insofar as you're working in the Gestalt, or the Newtonian framework, then it works. If you then are considering some system which is outside of that framework, or which extends beyond the bounds of validity of that framework, then you need another framework. And then, general relativity itself starts to break down at certain points, and you move out of that framework.
Would you say...
So when I shifted, I would say, into monotheism, it's not that quantum theory became any more right and wrong. My understanding of its domain of validity shifted slightly, because for me it was no longer a foundational basis on which I could make arguments about the nature and existence of things. So its ontological status changed, but its nature, the mathematics of it, and the evidences for it didn't change at all.
Or another way of putting it is levels of abstraction. So when it comes to the big level, general relativity, Newtonian mechanics works. When it comes to a smaller level, that level of abstraction, it won't work.
Right, so this goes back to what I said about knowledge being separated in different compartments. As an atheist, I had a little cave over here, and I jumped to another cave over there, and I'm in this cave, I'm being consistent. I'm in this cave, I'm being consistent. And the fact that I'm inconsistent between the two, it never even appeared, never made sense. But it's almost because my brain wasn't even able to think at a high enough level of abstraction to really connect those things. And it was only really when I had, this top-down monotheism that I was then able to see them more and more.
That's the point.
And
top-down,
all the other abstraction layers then fit somewhere between, Allah and everything else. Whereas previously, all the different abstraction layers are their own separate parcels, and you specialize, and you've got a lot of faith in other specialists. Even, when you're studying quantum mechanics, let's say, you have to understand complex analysis. You can't do it without complex analysis. Complex analysis and relies on counter sequences and things like that, and you might learn what those
constraint conditions.
But there's always at some point your professor goes, you have to just trust that's been done by those people. And I spent 15 years or more since I graduated buying up books from 1750 up to present day, following all those rabbit holes because I'm an autistic geek on this stuff. And it is really, really fascinating to see that the amount of faith that is actually required and that is baked in, but in a very sort of hidden way.
Absolutely.
But
I love what you said, that top-down theology, or we could say the epistemic doors being wide open because of La ilaha illallah. It makes everything make sense.
It was, honestly, this was probably the most incredible thing, was as soon as this concept of what a deity actually was flipped, right? As soon as I realized I can straw manning deity this whole time, and if I take the actual concept that it is, then I'm a polytheist and a hypocrite. Okay, let's talk about this more seriously. There must be some way to sort this out, and so on and so forth. Ended up with the sort of logical acceptance of La ilaha illallah, to which I was very frustrated at the time. You can do, I think we're just finishing, but
He deserves a coffee after this, so we're going to go.
Okay. I was actually quite frustrated to find out having two crude, had very different plans for university than becoming a pious person. It was something I had to emotionally wrestle with. I very much didn't want it. But
it's a beautiful journey, though.
In retrospect, it certainly was. But at the time, it was quite terrifying and frustrating. And then, but the one thing that sort of, I think the first benefit, I could say, was all of a sudden the ability to think top down, the ability to see things in their place relative to each other, to break down the artificial boundaries between knowledge that have been put in place from the rationalists through the Enlightenment period and so on. Like all of that baggage blowing away. I didn't lose any of the maths. Quite opposite. I now saw how it connected together. I could better understand the relationship between constructivism and formalism. I could better understand, how and why Maxwell really was doing what he was doing, and the way he had a beautiful synthesis of thermodynamics with classical mechanics as it had been discovered, as it had been understood through what's called Lagrange and so on. And it was an absolutely stunning thesis, which previously I didn't really understand the depth of it. But looking back, when I had this top-down structure, then I could really see the depth. Because one of the things really interesting is three of the real main characters that actually gave us the foundations upon which modern physics was built was Maxwell, Hamilton, and Peter Guthrie Tait. These three absolute giants, and they were all dedicated believers in God.
Interesting, I didn't know that.
And they weren't like three amigos. And Tait was also a theologian. And between them, they basically had the whole rest of the world of physics and mathematics, against them. And they really established, Hamilton established the idea of non-commutative algebra and all this sort of stuff. And basically, most of the ideas from Hamilton's thesis and Quaternions got lifted and taken by the likes of Sophus Lie and so on to build this, really the German school under Hilbert. And it was mostly stolen valor, the way it was done. It's all fascinating. I'm going to go off too much into the weeds, unfortunately, but basically it was Hamilton, and also Hamilton's principle, Hamiltonian mechanics, is fundamental to how we construct quantum mechanics now, particularly field theory. And Maxwell really established field theories writ large. And that's a whole other sort of detailed story.
So that's a part of history we don't know.
The reason we don't learn them is to go back to what I said before about flocking and things like this. Like, geopolitics has had such an important role in how physics develops, but it's not taught. I mean, the fact that the Germans regarded themselves as the men of electricity, they were like, the guys. And so for Maxwell to have come out with this part, we can't have that. And so there was always as long as they could then squish things into their framework, it would be, it would be okay. You have. I think it's probably too much detail to go into. Maybe we'll go into it now.
No, we should definitely. But I think, I think one way of definitely putting it is the Quranic verse that whoever Allah gives light, they walk in Allah's light. I'm paraphrasing. When you have the light of theology, everything makes sense, from quantum mechanics to societies.
Right. I think this was the key thing I wanted to get across, if nothing else, was that I previously thought it was a barrier to or alternative to rational inquiry and discourse.
When it's the fountain.
Exactly the opposite.
Let's go before...
It enabled it in an incredible way.
Let's go get some coffee, and before we get disrupted again. Do you know take these off? Where's the guy gone?
All the time. All the time.
Sorry, is this somebody's...
Yeah.
Muhammad had 13 vaginas to enjoy rest of his life.